Hello and welcome to the last programme in this series. This week we're going to be photographing garden birds in flight to get photographs like this. Now, if you were just going to stand in the garden, camera at the ready, and wait for small birds to fly past and try and capture them, it just wouldn't work unless you're incredibly lucky. You need a much better technique than that. It's all in the preparation, and the best way to do it, which can achieve really good results, is to shoot the birds as they approach a feeder. Now, the main essential ingredient for this is sunshine. You need a bright day because it's almost impossible to shoot small birds in flight without sufficient light. You've got to get a super fast shutter speed. Otherwise, your pictures are going to look like this. Maybe you like this, I don't know. Let's pretend it's creative blur. Maybe it does work, but it's a whole different style of photography. And then, assuming you don't want blurry pictures, with a little patience and perseverance, it should be possible to get some really good pictures. Now, for this shoot, the photography itself is actually surprisingly easy. Most of the work, most of the effort, most of the time is spent in setting up the stage and getting everything ready for when you start the photography. We're going to be shooting in manual focus because autofocus just isn't fast enough for small birds in flight, and we won't even be looking through the viewfinder. We're going to be using a remote control. More about all that in a minute. Let's look at the setup. So the first thing to do is to set up a bird feeder. Now, I've got one of my regular feeders I use for photography here, full of sunflower hearts. Hopefully you've got one already, but it needs to be in a fairly open position, not in the middle of nowhere. It needs to be 6 to 10 feet from a hedge or a bush, so the birds have somewhere safe to hide before they launch up to the feeder. But it needs to be in good light, so think about where the sun's going to be, when you're going to be shooting, whether it's going to be early in the morning, maybe before work, if you're good at getting up early in the morning, or late in the afternoon, and work out where the shadows are going to be. That's the key thing, so the birds aren't in shadow. Now, the other thing to think about is the background. So you're shooting to one side of the feeder, the hedge, the bush side of the feeder, and look at where the background is and what the background is, so you can get a nice blurry background to all your shots. And ideally, pick a bush or hedge with no obvious and easy natural perches along the edge. So the only other thing you have to set up is a perch, an artificial perch, and the whole point is you're going to get the birds to perch on the end and then fly across to the feeder. So you need them to use your perch because you need to judge where they're flying from and to. So what I've done is I've fixed a perch to some garden poles here on the edge of the hedge. Try not to use plastic ties for obvious reasons. You'll find using lots of plastic ties for this kind of thing if you're not careful, and obviously it's a bad thing to do. I've just used some string, and the whole point is to have this perch sticking out from the hedge about a foot or 18 inches, and that to be the perch that's the most sticky out perch, if you like. If there are other natural perches that might compete with it, then tuck those away or cut them. So this is the one perch the birds are going to use, and it's directly opposite the feeder. Now, it doesn't matter what it looks like. It can be a really ugly piece of wood, ugly branch, because that's not going to be in the photographs. All you want is a sufficiently strong branch for the birds to sidle along up to the tip there, perch there for a moment, wait till they feel confident, and then fly across to the feeder. Now, I think the key thing is to set it all up a few days, or ideally a week or so, before you're going to do the photography, so the birds can get used to it, and that encourages them to visit the feeder regularly, but also to use the artificial perch and do that flight across that you want them to do. When you're ready to take pictures, temporarily tape over all the feeder holes except for just one. So what you do is you leave the hole directly facing the perch open, and that's the one they're going to use for feeding. So hopefully with that one feeder hole open, the birds will land on the perch and fly in a straight line to that very hole, and you'll know exactly where to line up for photography. It's also a good idea to remove any other sources of food you might have in the garden, just temporarily, because otherwise, Murphy's Law, the birds might bypass your special photographic set and go to one of the other feeders. Just one last thought is that you might want to adjust the height of your feeder. You'll find that some birds will launch from the perch and they'll go down, glide down, and then fly up to the perch here. Others will go up and glide down. Some will go straight across. Others will very annoyingly do a glide around, sort of like a curve, which makes it very difficult to get them in focus. But have a look at what does what and work out where the best position to put the feeder is. Now for this particular shoot, I've just got the perch here at exactly the same level as the perch sticking out of the hedge. So that's the photographic set all up and running and ready. That's the hard bit. Now we're going to get on to the photography. So here's a little diagram to remind you of the setup, to summarize what we've done so far. What you need to do is to shoot from a spot that is perpendicular to the flight path to give the greatest chance of everything being in focus. So in other words, you need to be facing the exact line from the perch to the feeder, so the back of your camera is in the same plane. Now it might actually be worth measuring the distance from the camera, not the lens of course, because that's likely to move, but from the camera to the perch and the feeder to make sure they're equidistant. Well, today I'm going to be photographing from inside the kitchen. Doesn't get much easier than that. I've got the door open, of course. I've pulled the curtain so there are no distractions behind. I'm just going to sit here in the open doorway. Birds aren't bothered at all. I don't need a hide or anything fancy. The feeder is just over there. I've got the camera on a tripod ready to go, and I've got a 100 to 400mm lens on. Now I'm going to be shooting probably somewhere between 300 and 400mm. Now I could go in tighter with my long lens, but I don't want to do that because, as I said earlier, the trick is to pull back a little. So plenty of space, plenty of room to breathe, so as the birds fly in, there's less chance of chopping off a wingtip or a foot or a tail. It'll be impossible to predict exactly where in the frame the bird might pass, and you'll need plenty of space for flapping wings and extended legs and that kind of thing. You can increase your hit rate considerably by keeping the birds smaller in the frame and leaving plenty of room for manoeuvre. Then you simply crop back a bit in the computer. So what I'm going to do is to set up the camera on the tripod to focus on a point just to the left of the feeder. That's the perch side of the feeder. So the perch is over there, sticking out of the hedge. The feeder is over there. The birds are going to fly across, but I want to catch them just as they're about to land on the feeder. I'll focus on that point and leave it there for the whole shoot. Okay, so what about camera settings? Well, this is one of the few occasions when I'll shoot on manual. So I set the shutter speed and the aperture, and the camera then selects the ISO. I've put the ISO on auto, and then the camera can adjust the exposure according to the amount of light and still get it just right. So shutter speed, you need a fast shutter speed because you're shooting small birds in flight, obviously. If you're shooting even at 1/2000th of a second, you're very likely to get at least some blur in the wings, certainly in the wingtips, maybe the whole wings as well. I like to shoot at least a 1/3200th of a second, ideally a 4000th of a second, and many of the pictures I'll show you in a bit were taken at 1/8000th of a second, which is why it does need to be a very bright day or you get a ridiculously high ISO. At 4000th of a second, most small birds, most flight paths, you're going to get a nice sharp photograph with everything tack sharp. As far as the aperture is concerned, I like to shoot at f5.6. The background's far enough away for that still to provide a nice colour wash, a nice blurry background, and it gives a little bit of depth of field so the whole bird is sharp. If the background's a bit closer, you might experiment. If your lens goes wide enough, try shooting at f4, but just see how that works. f8 and smaller, you tend to get a less blurry background, and the background can be quite distracting. So here's a little summary of those settings. Then you set the maximum number of frames per second your camera allows. The more the merrier. It's amazing how many images of a bird in flight you have to take in order to capture just one in which the wing positions are perfect. So here's the final little tip. This is the real trick, and that is don't look through the viewfinder. If you're looking through the viewfinder at that little patch, that little area to the left of the feeder, and you wait for a bird to fly in, by the time you see it and you realise you've seen it and you've pressed the button, you've reacted to it, the bird will be on the feeder, be way out of frame. It'll have died of old age. It'll take you so long in relative terms. So the only way to do it is to use a remote control. Now what I'm doing, the camera's all set up, I've got the remote in my hand, I can have a beer or a coffee in this hand, doesn't matter, and I'm watching the perch. And you watch a bird sidle up to the end of the perch, and you've got to look for clues. I mean, you can ideally start shooting before it actually takes off, the moment it just about does it. So it might do a little poo, it might do a twitch, it might stretch its wings, anything that gives you a hint it's about to go and fly across to the feeder. As soon as it does, start firing with the remote, and you'll be going brrr, and it will fly across to the feeder, and you've got a very good chance of getting some shots of it flying through your frame. And that's the only realistic way to do it. Great flight photography is all about wing position. You're going to have to take hundreds of images, if not thousands, to achieve the most attractive results, which are typically catching the wings in a perfect downbeat or a perfect upbeat. And you're inevitably going to get an awful lot of duffs with wings in uncomfortable positions. That's uncomfortable from a human perspective, of course, as well as birds out of the plane of focus, not sharp, wings or tails chopped off at the edges of the frame, and many other things that can go wrong. One thing I've noticed is it's amazing how much time small birds spend flying like Superman, which looks very odd and isn't particularly great for photography. And finally, don't forget to keep looking at the photographs you're taking in the back of the camera, because this is a numbers game. Every shot is not going to be perfect by any means. There are going to be loads of duds, loads of deletes. There'll be birds that have flown slightly out of the plane of focus, birds with blurry wingtips, feet chopped off. I had a great shot the other day that was ruined by a fly flying in front of the lens. So all sorts of things can go wrong. Some of them you can control, and if you keep checking how you're doing, you can adjust the focus a little bit or just the composition, just tweak it slightly and get more hits. Once you've got it all working really well, it's a fantastic technique and really does produce some wonderful results. So I guess the proof is in the pudding. So what I've done is I've put together a little selection of photographs that I've taken using exactly this technique from my open kitchen doorway here. And these were all taken in just 3 hours of shooting to show you what's possible. Thanks very much for watching.